I am Liam, 32 years old. 3 years ago, my own flesh and blood watched my entire life burn to the ground and refused to hand me a single drop of water to put out the flames. Tonight, I was about to serve them a cold, hard lesson in power, right in the middle of a crowded, high-end steakhouse. While I was sitting quietly at the far end of the table, trying to swallow down years of humiliation, my father stood up, raised his crystal wine glass, and pointed it directly at my older brother. He told 20 of our closest relatives that my brother was his real son, the successful one, and thanked God he wasn't a wasted potential like me. They all laughed right in my face. But there is one thing they absolutely did not know. They had no idea that my wife and I had spent the last 3 years building a silent financial empire, and the very company they were bragging about no longer belonged to them. And very soon, they would be staring down the barrel of their own ruin. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their arrogant dynasty piece by piece, please hit that like button if you believe that karma never misses an address. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us go back to the exact moment the nightmare began. The private dining room at the Wellington Steakhouse was designed to make people feel important. The walls were lined with dark mahogany wood. The lighting was a warm, expensive amber, and the chandeliers above us looked like they belonged in a palace. My father, Richard, had booked the entire back room to celebrate the recent corporate promotion of my older brother, Marcus. The air was thick with the smell of roasted garlic, aged prime rib, and the suffocating stench of old money arrogance. I sat at the very edge of the long oak table. They had placed me right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, a physical representation of where I stood in the family hierarchy. Every time a waiter pushed through the doors, a rush of hot air and the clatter of dirty dishes washed over me. It was a deliberate seating choice. In my family, proximity to my father was the ultimate currency, and I was entirely bankrupt. Marcus sat at the head of the table, directly to my father's right. Marcus was the undisputed golden child. He wore a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. He wore a heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, making sure to flash it every time he reached for his expensive Cabernet. He had parked his brand-new white Lamborghini Aventador right at the front entrance, tipping the valet a $100 bill just to keep it in plain sight of the front windows. Marcus was the newly appointed vice president of Dalton and Ross, a massive corporate conglomerate that my father treated with religious reverence. Every single one of my aunts, uncles, and cousins leaned toward Marcus as if he possessed the secrets to the universe. They asked him for insider tips on real estate investments. They asked him how to maximize their 401k portfolios. They desperately wanted to ensure they remained in his good graces, heavily anticipating the day the family inheritance would be divided. I looked down at my plate. The perfectly cooked steak suddenly looked completely unappetizing. I felt a familiar, heavy stone of anxiety settling deep in my stomach. I hated these dinners. I hated the constant, unspoken comparisons. But I had promised my wife, Elena, that we would attend this one. I had promised her that tonight would be the final time we ever had to endure this specific brand of torture. Elena sat quietly beside me. She wore a simple, beautifully cut black dress. She did not need flashy designer logos to announce her presence. She possessed a quiet, unshakable confidence that terrified my family because they could never understand it. She reached under the heavy linen tablecloth and rested her hand gently on my knee. Her touch was warm and incredibly grounding. Suddenly, my father tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the low hum of conversation. The 20 relatives immediately fell silent, turning their faces toward the patriarch of the family. My father stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his suit and looked down the length of the table. He intentionally let his gaze slide right past me, treating me as if I were a stain on the carpet. "Family," my father began, his voice booming with theatrical authority. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate exceptionalism. We live in a world that rewards hard work, ruthlessness, and ambition, and nobody embodies those virtues better than my eldest son." My father raised his glass toward Marcus. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. "To our real son," my father declared loudly. "The successful one. The man who truly understands the value of a massive salary and corporate dominance. We celebrate you, Marcus. The world needs to know the absolute difference between driven ambition and, well, wasted potential." The silence in the room shifted. It morphed from respectful attention to a cruel, collective judgment. My father's eyes finally locked onto mine, and they were filled with nothing but cold disdain. Every single head at the table turned to look at me, the pitying glances, the second-hand embarrassment. My aunt cleared her throat awkwardly. My cousin averted his eyes, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his butter knife. My own mother, sitting across from my father, simply tightened her grip on her napkin and looked down at her lap. She had spent 30 years choosing my father's wealth over her children's well-being, and she was not going to break that pattern tonight. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The diamonds on his cufflinks caught the amber light. "So, Liam," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "what is it you are doing these days? Still trying to make it with that little freelancing gig?" He said the word freelancing as if it were a highly contagious disease. A few suppressed laughs rippled around the table. My uncle covered his mouth to hide a wide grin. I felt a hot flush of anger rise from my chest, burning my throat. "I am keeping myself very busy, Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. "Right, keeping busy," Marcus chuckled, looking around the table to gather his audience. "Well, we cannot all be executives at Dalton and Ross, right? Somebody has to do the small jobs. But listen, Liam, if you and Elena ever decide to start a family, and you realize you need a real college fund for your kids, let my assistant know. I might have some low-level data entry work you can handle from home." The entire table erupted into genuine, roaring laughter. My father slapped the table, highly amused by the public execution of my dignity. They were feasting on my humiliation. They were treating my supposed failure as the main course of their extravagant dinner. Underneath the table, Elena's hand slid down from my knee and gripped my fingers. Her grip was startlingly strong. I turned my head slightly to look at her. Her beautiful face was completely calm, a mask of absolute serenity, but her dark eyes were burning with a terrifying, calculated fire. She leaned in toward me. The scent of her vanilla perfume cut directly through the suffocating smell of roasted meat and family betrayal. Her lips hovered just inches from my ear. "Time to tell them," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly soft, yet it rang louder in my mind than the roaring laughter of 20 people. I looked back at the table. I looked at my father, who was still chuckling, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. I looked at Marcus, who was basking in the adoration of a family that worshipped his bank account. I had spent 3 grueling years waiting for this exact moment. I had spent 3 years biting my tongue, swallowing my pride, and building a weapon so massive they would never see it coming. I took a deep, slow breath. The furious pounding of my heart began to slow down, transforming from anxious panic into a steady, lethal rhythm. I squeezed Elena's hand back. I was ready to turn this celebratory feast into an absolute funeral. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen in that dining room, you have to understand the absolute devastation I had to crawl out from. You have to understand exactly how deeply my family buried me 3 years ago. I was never the golden child. While Marcus was groomed for the corporate boardroom, handed internships at massive financial firms, and gifted a luxury condo for his college graduation, I was the creative outcast. I wanted to build things. I started my own boutique design firm right out of a cheap, unheated apartment. I poured every single ounce of my soul, my energy, and my very limited savings into that company. For a while, it worked. We had a small, incredibly dedicated team. We built beautiful digital interfaces for local businesses. We were not making millions, but I was proud of what I had created with my own 2 hands. Then, a brutal economic downturn hit our sector. 3 of my biggest clients filed for bankruptcy within the exact same month. They defaulted on massive contracts. Overnight, my cash flow completely vanished. I was staring down a mountain of operational debt, office lease payments, and a payroll I absolutely could not meet. I sold my car. I maxed out every single credit card I owned. But it was not enough. The walls were closing in, and I had nowhere else to turn. I swallowed the massive pride I had carefully guarded my entire life and drove a rented, beat-up sedan to my father's sprawling estate in the wealthiest suburb of the city. I remember walking into his expansive, oak-paneled study. The room always smelled of imported leather, expensive scotch, and aged cigars. My father sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing highly confidential real estate portfolios. I stood before him like a beggar. I placed my detailed business recovery plan, my financial projections, and a legally binding loan agreement on his desk. I was not asking for a handout. I was asking for a secured loan with a high interest rate, fully backed by a lawyer. I just needed enough capital to bridge the gap for 3 months until new contracts cleared. My father did not even glance at the meticulously prepared documents. He simply leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepled his fingers, and stared at me with an expression of profound, crushing disappointment. "Liam," my father said, his voice laced with icy condescension, "I warned you from the very beginning that art and digital design were not real businesses. They are hobbies for people who cannot handle the rigorous demands of the corporate world. You decided to play at being a businessman and you lost the game. I am certainly not going to throw my hard-earned money into a sinking ship just to protect your fragile ego. Dad, it is strictly a temporary cash flow crisis," I pleaded, absolutely hating the desperate tremor in my own voice. "I have new clients lined up for the 3rd quarter. I just need a lifeline. I will pay you back every single cent with interest." "Absolutely not," he snapped, his tone turning completely ruthless. "You want to learn how the real world operates? This is exactly it. Failure carries heavy consequences. If I bail you out now, you will never learn. Maybe when you lose everything, you will finally understand what it takes to be a ruthless winner like your brother Marcus. I refuse to finance your mediocrity." He waved his hand, dismissing me like a stray dog begging for scraps. I walked out of his mansion knowing my fate was sealed. 2 brutal weeks later, I had to look my loyal employees in the eye and lay them all off. I filed for corporate bankruptcy. The bank seized my business accounts. I was evicted from my apartment because I could not make the rent. I hit the absolute, unforgiving bottom of human existence. I remember sitting on a park bench in the freezing rain, counting loose quarters just to buy a cheap cup of instant noodles, wondering if my life was completely over. During this darkest period of my life, my family did not offer a single shred of comfort. In fact, they used my spectacular failure to elevate themselves. The very month I lost my company, Marcus purchased his first Lamborghini. He intentionally drove it past the cheap, rundown motel I was forced to live in, just to ensure I saw the glaring difference between us. When the family gathered for Thanksgiving dinner that year, my father spent 3 agonizing hours delivering a speech about how Marcus had ruthlessly outmaneuvered a rival executive to secure a promotion at Dalton and Ross. He framed Marcus as a conqueror. He framed me as a cautionary tale. Nobody at that table asked how I was surviving. Nobody offered me a place to sleep. I was a ghost, a living disappointment they used to make themselves feel vastly superior. They entirely wrote me off. They assumed I would just curl up and accept my role as the family failure. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They severely underestimated the sheer, terrifying motivation of a man who has had everything stripped away from him. That was the exact year I met Elena. I was sitting in a crowded, noisy coffee shop, using their free internet to blindly apply for low-level corporate jobs. I was exhausted, bitter, and completely hollowed out. Elena was rushing past my table and accidentally spilled half of her iced coffee onto my only clean shirt. Instead of muttering a quick apology and running away, she immediately sat down across from me, handed me a stack of napkins, and insisted on paying for my dry cleaning. She looked at my laptop screen, saw the endless rejection emails, and asked me a simple question. What exactly are you trying to build? I do not know why, but I poured my heart out to a complete stranger. I told her about the bankruptcy, the crushing debt, and the absolute betrayal of my own family. I fully expected her to nod politely and leave. Instead, Elena looked me dead in the eyes, her gaze incredibly sharp and piercing. Failure is just raw data, Liam, she said, her voice steady and commanding. It tells you exactly where the weak points are. You do not cry over a collapsed building. You study the rubble and then you build a fortress. Now close that browser. Let us get to work. Elena was a genuine force of nature. She owned a small, struggling tech startup that had brilliant back-end engineering but a completely unworkable user interface. I possessed the exact design expertise she desperately needed. We formed a partnership right there in that coffee shop. We merged her brilliant coding with my high-end design architecture. We worked 20-hour days for 2 straight years. We lived on cheap takeout food, black coffee, and pure, concentrated spite. We built an agency that provided seamless, comprehensive digital transformations for massive corporate clients. Our synergy was unstoppable. When we landed our first multimillion-dollar contract with a global logistics firm, we did not celebrate with champagne. We immediately reinvested every single dollar. We bought lucrative commercial real estate in up-and-coming districts. We acquired smaller, specialized tech firms to absorb their patents. Our revenue did not just grow, it absolutely exploded. We became highly influential, silent power players in the city's elite financial sector. And through it all, we kept my family completely in the dark. Whenever my mother bothered to call me once every 6 months, I kept my answers incredibly vague. I told her I was still struggling with freelance work. I told her money was tight. I intentionally fed them the exact narrative they desperately wanted to hear. Let them think I was weak. Let them think I was beneath them. It provided us with the perfect camouflage to orchestrate our ultimate strike. Because while Marcus was busy spending his massive corporate salary on customized suits, VIP bottle service at nightclubs, and maintaining a lifestyle he could barely afford, the very company that provided his status was quietly bleeding to death. Marcus was wildly arrogant, but he was fundamentally incompetent. He had filled the executive ranks at Dalton and Ross with his drinking buddies. He alienated crucial, long-term clients with his aggressive frat house negotiation tactics. The company's profit margins had been in a terrifying freefall for 3 consecutive quarters. Elena and I knew this intimately because we had been aggressively analyzing the market. We utilized our vast resources to hire elite forensic accountants and private investigators. We dug deep into the heavily guarded financial records of Dalton and Ross. We discovered that Arthur, the elderly, deeply respected chairman of the board, was desperately searching for an exit strategy. Arthur was exhausted. He wanted to retire, but he was absolutely terrified of leaving his life's legacy in the hands of my father and my brother, who were clearly driving the corporation straight into a brick wall. Arthur needed a savior. He needed a buyer with incredibly deep pockets, a spotless track record of corporate turnarounds, and the absolute ruthlessness required to purge the toxic management team. He needed us. The secret meeting with Chairman Arthur took place in the heavily guarded, private VIP suite of a downtown luxury hotel, far removed from the gossiping circles of the corporate world. The room was silent, insulated from the city noise below. Arthur sat across a heavy glass table from Elena and me. He looked frail, his shoulders slumped beneath his expensive suit, and his eyes carried the heavy burden of a man watching his empire slowly crumble. Spread across the glass table were our meticulously prepared financial statements, our aggressive restructuring strategy, and a massive proof of funds document. Arthur pulled his reading glasses down to the bridge of his nose and looked at me for a long, agonizing minute. "I have to be completely honest with you, Liam," Arthur said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "When my legal team first brought me your inquiry regarding a full acquisition, I nearly ordered them to throw it in the shredder. Your father, Richard, is a fiercely difficult and highly arrogant man, and your brother Marcus is an absolute walking liability. He is toxic. I naturally assumed you were cut from the exact same poisonous cloth. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly straight, projecting absolute calm. I assure you, Arthur, I share nothing with those men except a last name. In fact, my primary operational directive upon taking control is to execute a complete and total housecleaning. The rampant nepotism, the grossly inflated expense accounts, the hostile work environment. All of it terminates the exact second the ink dries on the contract. Arthur sighed heavily, resting his hand on a thick, red folder. I am painfully aware of the declining revenue. I know Marcus has been aggressively misusing company funds to secure personal favors and inflate his own public image. It is an absolute disaster. If I do not execute a sale immediately, the board of directors will undoubtedly force a highly public, incredibly messy hostile takeover within the next 12 months. But I refuse to hand my life's work over to a soulless private equity firm that would simply gut the assets, fire the loyal staff, and sell the scraps. He turned his gaze to Elena, studying her sharp, intelligent expression, and then looked back at me. My investigators looked into your agency. You two have built an absolute juggernaut from nothing. You clearly understand the genuine value of strategic vision and hard work. I am willing to sell my controlling shares directly to you. But I must warn you, when Richard and Marcus discover what you have done, it is going to be an absolute bloodbath. They truly believe this company is their royal birthright. Let me worry about handling my family, Arthur, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the table. I am fully prepared for the fallout. Do we have a binding agreement? Arthur extended his trembling hand across the table. We have a deal, Liam. We did not just buy a few shares. We bought the absolute, unquestionable majority control of Dalton and Ross. We bought the massive high-rise headquarters. We bought the lucrative government contracts. We bought the crippling debts Marcus had secretly accrued. We did not just become their new employers. We literally owned the ground they walked on. The massive transfer of power and wealth was locked down behind ironclad non-disclosure agreements, legally sealed until the upcoming mandatory board meeting on Monday morning. Which brings us crashing right back into the suffocating atmosphere of the Wellington Steakhouse. The sharp clinking of silverware against fine china. The overwhelming smell of roasted meat and expensive wine. The cruel, mocking laughter of my father and my brother echoing off the mahogany walls. Time to tell them, Elena had whispered. I reached out and placed my linen napkin carefully on the table, smoothing the edges with deliberate slowness. The slight, out-of-place movement caught my father's eye. He frowned deeply, clearly annoyed that the designated family failure was daring to interrupt his grand, self-congratulatory speech. Did you have something important to add to the conversation, Liam? My father demanded, his tone dripping with heavy sarcasm and utter disdain. Perhaps you want to offer Marcus some crucial advice on how to stretch a $20 bill at the grocery store? More vicious snickers erupted from the cousins sitting across from me. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not show a single ounce of the furious anger burning inside my chest. I simply looked directly at my father, my facial expression completely blank and utterly unreadable. Actually, Dad, I do have something to add to this celebration, I said, my voice cutting through the ambient restaurant noise like a freshly sharpened scalpel. It is a very funny thing regarding the future of Dalton and Ross. Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically, throwing his hands up in the air. Oh, here we go. The brilliant freelancer is going to give the vice president corporate strategy advice. Somebody please get a notebook and a pen. It changed ownership last week, I stated, the words dropping from my mouth like heavy lead weights. The laughter in the private room died instantly. It was as if someone had pulled a vacuum switch and sucked every single molecule of oxygen out of the space. My father slowly lowered his crystal wine glass, his thick, graying eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. What exactly are you talking about? My father demanded, his voice dropping a full octave, a hint of genuine uncertainty creeping into his tone. Arthur has absolutely not sold the company. We would have been notified. I am a senior consultant. Marcus is the vice president. We would know. Elena leaned forward gracefully, resting her elegant forearms on the heavy oak table. Her voice was incredibly smooth, perfectly calm, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. He did sell it, Richard, Elena stated, locking her dark eyes directly onto my father. Every single voting share, every corporate asset, every subsidiary. The legal paperwork was completely finalized and filed last Friday afternoon. Marcus suddenly slammed his open palm onto the table, making the expensive silverware rattle violently against the plates. That is a pathetic lie. That is absolute garbage. Liam, who supposedly bought it. Some shady shell corporation? I am the acting vice president. Absolutely nobody breathes oxygen in that building without me signing off on it. You will find out all the exact details on Monday morning at the emergency board of directors meeting. Marcus? Elena replied, not breaking eye contact, her voice as hard as diamond. Your executive assistant already confirmed the mandatory calendar invite. You might want to check your corporate phone. Marcus practically ripped his sleek smartphone out of the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His thumbs frantically swiped across the illuminated screen. The silence in the dining room was so absolute you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. I watched intently as the color rapidly drained from my older brother's face. His usually tan skin suddenly looked sickly and gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Marcus? My father barked, real panic finally bleeding into his authoritative voice. Marcus, what the hell does the email say? Marcus slowly raised his head, his eyes blown wide with a sickening mixture of absolute horror and complete disbelief. He looked like a man who had just watched his own execution order being printed. It is a formal notification of a complete ownership transfer. A mandatory all-hands executive meeting is scheduled for Monday at exactly 9 a.m. My father's crystal glass hit the table with a sharp, heavy thud. Dark red wine sloshed violently over the rim, staining the pristine white tablecloth like a pool of fresh blood. He turned his furious, burning gaze back to me. Who? My father growled, the thick veins in his neck bulging aggressively against his silk tie. Who bought the company, Liam? Tell me right this second. I sat back in my chair, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I looked directly at the man who had systematically torn down my self-worth, who had viciously laughed at my darkest moments of bankruptcy, who had treated me like dirt on his shoe for my entire adult life. You stood up tonight and said you were incredibly proud of your real son, I said softly, but the words echoed violently in the dead silent room. You should be very, very careful about who you classify as real dad, because it turns out, the son you constantly overlook, the son you publicly mock, is the exact same man who just legally signed your future paychecks. The silence that followed that statement was absolute poetry. Nobody dared to breathe. My aunt's hand trembled so violently she dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud, piercing clatter. My mother quickly covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock and terror. Marcus looked like he was going to physically vomit right onto his expensive prime rib. I stood up slowly, calmly buttoning the front of my jacket. Elena stood up gracefully beside me, looking absolutely radiant and completely untouchable. Please enjoy the rest of the dinner, I said to the room of frozen statues. It is entirely on me. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy, black titanium American Express card, and threw it onto the table. It landed with a sharp smack right next to the spilled red wine. We turned around and walked out of the private dining room. We did not look back. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind us, violently cutting off the suffocating silence of my treacherous family, I finally took a deep, cleansing breath of the cool night air. I genuinely thought the worst part of the war was over. I thought the sheer shock of the revelation would paralyze them into absolute submission. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong. I did not sleep a single second that night. The heavy adrenaline was still pumping relentlessly through my veins, feeling like battery acid burning in my chest. The echoing silence of that restaurant dining room clung to my skin like thick smoke. I stood alone by the large kitchen window of our quiet suburban home the next morning, watching the sun slowly crest over the horizon, painting the morning sky in dark bruises of deep purple and violent orange. My cell phone had been vibrating aggressively against the granite countertop since midnight. I had 37 missed calls from my father. I had an endless stream of furious, completely unhinged text messages from Marcus demanding I answer the phone. I ignored every single one of them. Elena walked into the kitchen barefoot, wearing one of my oversized dress shirts, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. She walked over and handed me a mug, her facial expression completely unreadable. "They are going to come here," she said quietly, taking a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning the quiet street outside our window. "I know they are," I replied, staring at the empty road. People like my father and my brother absolutely cannot tolerate a loss of control. Their massive pride will not allow them to simply sit still and wait until Monday morning. They need to lash out. Right on cue, the security camera notification on our front gate chimed loudly through the house. I turned and looked at the digital security monitor mounted on the kitchen wall. My father's massive, imposing black Porsche Cayenne rolled aggressively up our driveway, followed mere seconds later by Marcus's obnoxious, roaring white Lamborghini Aventador. They parked haphazardly, their tires crushing the edge of our manicured lawn, practically blocking the entire street. I was not the least bit surprised they easily found our private address. My mother had visited exactly one time, over 2.5 years ago, in a brief, highly uncomfortable, half-hearted attempt to drop off a generic Christmas card before rushing back to the safety of her country club social life. I could already feel the sheer, destructive hurricane of rage that was about to violently hit our front door. I did not flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground my nerves. I walked down the hallway toward the front door just as the doorbell was held down in a continuous, angry, buzzing assault. Someone started pounding a heavy fist against the solid oak wood of the door. I calmly unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door wide open. My father stood on my front porch, his face flushed a very dangerous shade of deep crimson. He was aggressively clutching a thick stack of printed papers in his large fist, crushing the edges in his grip. Marcus stood right behind his shoulder, pacing back and forth like a trapped, rabid animal, his designer sunglasses pushed up into his perfectly styled hair. "You think this is some kind of hilarious, sick joke?" My father roared at the top of his lungs before the door was even fully open. He immediately stepped aggressively into my personal space, trying to use his larger physical presence to intimidate me, a bullying tactic that had worked perfectly for 30 years. "You walk into a private family dinner, you violently humiliate your brother in front of every relative we have, and you spew these ridiculous, pathetic, easily disproven lies? Good morning to you too, Dad," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe, absolutely refusing to yield a single inch of physical space to him. "I see you finally got my message." Marcus aggressively pushed past my father, his face twisted into an incredibly ugly, hateful sneer. "Listen to me very carefully, you little piece of trash. I called Arthur's private residential line at 6 o'clock this morning. He completely ignored me. I called the corporate legal department. They entirely shut me out. Whatever stupid, pathetic rumor you managed to start, whatever fake, forged document you photoshopped to impress your wife, I am going to bury you in a massive lawsuit so deep you will never see the light of day again. I will legally take every single thing you own. I will fight for full legal custody of every single asset you falsely claim to possess." "A lawsuit?" I asked, raising an eyebrow in mock surprise. I took a step back and gestured openly into the hallway of my home. "Please, come inside. Let us discuss this impending lawsuit calmly over a fresh pot of coffee." My father aggressively stomped over the threshold into the entryway, bringing the suffocating smell of expensive cologne and pure, unadulterated rage right into my sanctuary. Marcus followed closely behind, glaring at our modest, tasteful furnishings as if they were infected with a disease. Do not play your stupid little games with me, Liam, my father snarled, violently throwing the crushed stack of papers onto my entryway console table. There is absolutely no physical way Arthur sold Dalton and Ross to a failure like you. You are a bankrupt freelancer. You do not possess the required capital. You do not have the elite banking connections. The senior board of directors would have immediately blocked any such transaction. Elena walked gracefully out of the kitchen, her silver laptop tucked securely under one arm. She looked at the two sweating, furiously angry men with the detached, analytical curiosity of a scientist observing a very interesting, but ultimately harmless insect. Actually, Richard, the board of directors did not know anything about the transaction until the ink was completely dry on the final contracts. That is the sheer beauty of a fully private, majority shareholder buyout, Elena said smoothly, setting her laptop down on the console table next to his scattered papers. She tapped the keyboard a few times, bringing up an official, heavily encrypted legal PDF document. Arthur held the ultimate controlling interest. He desperately wanted out of the nightmare you two created. We offered him a massive premium, an all-cash buyout that he simply could not refuse. Marcus scoffed loudly, a harsh, barking sound, but his panicked eyes darted nervously toward the glowing laptop screen. You are bluffing. You absolutely do not have access to that kind of liquid money. Check your corporate executive email right now, Marcus, Elena said, her voice dropping all pretense of social politeness, becoming cold and commanding. The corporate legal department just unlocked the detailed transaction files for the senior executive team 5 minutes ago. Read it. Marcus yanked his smartphone out of his pocket again. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the hardwood floor. He scrambled to unlock it, his breath coming in short, erratic, panicked gasps. He tapped the screen, opening his secure corporate email application. I stood in silence and watched him read. I watched his wide eyes rapidly scan the dense legal jargon, the binding corporate signatures, the undeniable, concrete proof of his own spectacular downfall. The remaining color completely vanished from his face. He looked like a man who was about to suffer a massive heart attack right in my hallway. This is massive corporate fraud, Marcus stammered wildly, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. This transaction has to be totally illegal. The contract is completely ironclad, Marcus, I said, taking a deliberate step forward. I was no longer the scared, bankrupt kid begging for a desperate loan in his study. I was the absolute master of the board. Arthur was looking to retire. We simply showed him our extensive investment portfolio. We showed him our flawless track record of completely rebuilding failing tech companies. And much more importantly, we showed him the highly confidential internal financial audit of your specific department. My father's head snapped violently toward me, his eyes wide. What internal audit? The exact audit that mathematically proves Marcus has been aggressively bleeding the corporate accounts dry just to fund his lavish, pathetic lifestyle, I said, letting the heavy words hang in the air like a descending guillotine blade. The luxury client dinners that literally never happened. The wildly inflated executive expense reports. The shady commercial real estate deals that suspiciously funneled massive commissions directly to his fraternity friends. Arthur knew everything, and he specifically chose to sell the entire empire to me, simply to save his life's legacy from being utterly destroyed by your precious golden boy. My father slowly turned and stared at Marcus, a flicker of genuine, terrifying panic finally crossing his eyes for the very first time in his life. Marcus, look at me. Is this true? Marcus took a terrified step backward, his back hitting the wall of my hallway. Dad. No, you have to listen to me. It is completely out of context. They are maliciously manipulating the accounting numbers to frame me. My father turned back to face me, his large hands curling tightly into fists at his sides. You planned this massive betrayal entirely behind my back. You waited in the shadows for 3 entire years, plotting this elaborate scheme, just to violently ruin your own family. You made absolutely sure I had nothing left to lose, Dad. Do you remember that day in your study? I met his furious, burning gaze without blinking a single time. You laughed in my face when I was facing bankruptcy. You explicitly told me that failure had severe consequences. You told me to learn exactly how the real, ruthless world works. Well, Dad, I learned. I learned quietly. I learned efficiently. And I am applying every single one of those brutal lessons right now. You honestly think this hostile takeover makes you a winner? My father spat, though his voice notably lacked its usual booming, unshakable authority. You are nothing but a vindictive, ungrateful, pathetic son. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously soft whisper. It finally makes me free. Monday morning, exactly 9 a.m. Do not be late to the boardroom. I absolutely hate tardiness. I reached past him, grabbed the handle of my front door, and pulled it wide open, silently demanding they leave my property. For a long, agonizing minute, absolutely nobody moved. The heavy grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the seconds. Then my father slowly looked down at the hardwood floor, his broad shoulders noticeably slumping just a fraction of an inch. He walked slowly out of the door without saying another word. Marcus quickly followed him, stopping at the threshold to shoot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. You are going to deeply regret this, Liam, Marcus hissed maliciously. I will personally burn that entire company to the ground before I ever let a failure like you run it. I closed the door right in his face, the heavy, metallic click of the deadbolt sounding exactly like a gunshot echoing through the quiet house. I turned around and looked at Elena. She smiled at me, a fierce, incredibly proud smile. The battle lines had been permanently drawn. The family was completely and utterly broken. But the real, brutal corporate war, the war for the absolute soul of the company and my own ultimate vindication, was going to begin the moment we stepped into that boardroom on Monday morning. And I was more than ready to bring the entire corporate structure crashing down directly onto their heads. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to build your life back from absolute ground zero after the very people who were supposed to support you intentionally tore you down? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, sharp clarity that usually follows a violent thunderstorm. The sky over the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the morning sun reflected off the towering glass skyscrapers of the financial district. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my bedroom, meticulously adjusting the deep navy silk tie around my collar. I was no longer the desperate, bankrupt kid wearing a slightly worn-out suit, begging for a financial lifeline in my father's suffocating study. I was dressed in a bespoke, hand-tailored suit that projected absolute authority. Elena stood behind me, her reflection catching my eye in the mirror. She was wearing a stunning, razor-sharp charcoal blazer, looking like an incredibly dangerous corporate assassin. We did not exchange a single word. We did not need to. The battle lines had been drawn over the weekend, and today was the day we were going to completely level the battlefield. We drove to the Dalton and Ross corporate headquarters in absolute silence. The building was an imposing, 60-story monolith of dark glass and heavy steel, a monument to the corporate arrogance my father and brother worshipped so deeply. As we walked through the massive revolving glass doors into the expansive marble lobby, the atmosphere was instantly electric. The corporate rumor mill had clearly been working entirely overtime over the weekend. Groups of employees huddled near the expensive coffee bar and the security turnstiles, speaking in hushed, nervous whispers. The moment they saw Elena and me walking toward the VIP executive elevators, the entire lobby fell dead silent. Security guards, who had previously been instructed by my brother Marcus to never allow me past the front desk, immediately stepped aside and respectfully swiped their master keycards to open the private elevator bank for us. Word had definitely come down from the top. The high-speed elevator ride to the 60th floor felt like it took an absolute eternity. My heart was beating in a slow, heavy, measured rhythm against my ribs. When the polished steel doors finally slid silently open, we stepped onto the plush, thick carpet of the executive suite. The air up here was always perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive floor wax and old leather. We walked deliberately down the long hallway toward the main boardroom. I could hear the muffled, angry booming of my father's voice echoing through the heavy double mahogany doors before I even reached for the brass handles. I pushed the heavy doors open without knocking. The boardroom was spectacular, featuring a massive, 30-foot polished mahogany table surrounded by 24 high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the entire city skyline. Every single seat at the table was filled by a senior executive or a board member. At the very head of the table, sitting in the chairman's seat, was my father, Richard. He looked exhausted, his face heavily lined with stress, but he was desperately projecting an aura of supreme control. Marcus was sitting directly to his right, nervously tapping a gold pen against a legal pad, his designer suit looking slightly rumpled, as if he had spent the entire weekend pacing a hole in his luxury apartment floor. The moment I stepped into the room, every single head snapped in my direction. The tension in the air was so incredibly thick you could practically cut it with a knife. "What the hell do you think you are doing walking in here?" My father barked loudly, immediately standing up from his heavy leather chair, slamming both of his hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. "Security is supposed to be keeping unauthorized personnel out of this building. This is a highly classified, closed-door emergency session of the Senior Board of Directors. Get out of my boardroom right now, Liam, before I have you physically thrown out onto the street." I did not stop walking. I did not break eye contact with him. I walked slowly and deliberately down the entire length of the room, Elena matching my measured pace perfectly right beside me. We reached the opposite end of the massive table. I pulled out a chair and calmly sat down. Elena remained standing for a moment, slowly unzipping her leather briefcase. "You are sitting in the wrong chair, Richard," I said, my voice completely calm, echoing clearly across the silent expanse of the large room. "Arthur's seat belongs to the majority shareholder, and as of last Friday afternoon, you are looking directly at him." Marcus suddenly jumped to his feet, pointing the gold pen at me like a weapon. "Do not listen to a single word he says. This is a massive, highly coordinated scam. He is a failed freelancer who went completely bankrupt 3 years ago. There is absolutely no legal way he secured the capital required for a corporate acquisition of this massive scale. He is trying to orchestrate a fraudulent hostile takeover, and we are already preparing a massive lawsuit to have him thrown in federal prison." The other executives shifted incredibly uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Some of them looked nervously at my father, waiting for him to assert his dominance, while others looked directly at the thick, heavy legal binders Elena was currently pulling out of her briefcase. Elena systematically slid 5 massive, heavily bound legal documents down the length of the polished table. They stopped directly in front of the senior legal counsel and the chief financial officer. "Those are the fully executed, legally binding transfer agreements," Elena stated. Her voice as hard and cold as absolute ice. "Fully vetted, fully notarized, and completely finalized by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Every single voting share previously held by Chairman Arthur has been legally transferred to our holding company. We are not here to ask for your permission to take over. We are here to officially inform you that we already have." The senior legal counsel, a gray-haired man who had worked for Dalton and Ross for 20 years, slowly opened the first binder. He adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the top page. The entire room waited in agonizing silence as his eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal text. He flipped to the signature page. He stared at it for a long, heavy moment. Then he slowly took off his glasses, looked directly at my father, and let out a long, defeated breath. "Richard," the lawyer said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "the signatures are completely authentic. The SEC filing codes are fully verified in the global database. He owns it. He owns the absolute majority. They own the entire company." My father's face immediately drained of all its color, turning a horrifying shade of ashen gray. He slowly sank back down into the large leather chair, the fight completely leaving his body as the sheer, crushing weight of reality finally crashed down upon him. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, completely unable to process the absolute destruction of his lifelong corporate dynasty. But Marcus was absolutely not ready to surrender. His massive ego simply would not allow it. "This is completely unacceptable," Marcus screamed at the top of his lungs, his face turning a furious shade of bright purple. He slammed his fist onto the table. "I am the vice president of this corporation. I have dedicated years of my life to building this brand. I have personally secured massive real estate contracts. You cannot just walk in here and steal my massive salary, my guaranteed promotion, and my entire future. I demand an immediate injunction. You have not built a single thing in your entire pathetic life, Marcus," I said, my voice rising just enough to effortlessly cut through his hysterical screaming. "You have done nothing but aggressively tear this company apart from the inside out to fund your own desperate need for attention." I turned my attention to the opposite side of the table. "Victor, please take the floor." Victor, the chief financial officer of Dalton and Ross, a man who had looked physically sick with stress for the past 6 months, slowly stood up. He had a thick stack of printed financial reports clutched tightly in his hands. He refused to look at Marcus, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the paperwork. Following the strict directives of the new majority ownership, Victor began, his voice echoing nervously in the quiet room. "I was instructed to release the findings of the highly confidential internal financial audit that has been secretly running for the past 3 weeks. The numbers are extremely disturbing." Marcus froze completely, his eyes widening in absolute, terrifying panic. "Victor, shut your mouth right now. You are bound by a strict non-disclosure agreement. I am your direct superior." "Not anymore, he isn't," I interrupted coldly. "Keep reading, Victor. Tell the entire board exactly where the corporate profits have been going." Victor cleared his throat and continued reading from the detailed report. "Over the past 3 consecutive quarters, corporate revenue has plummeted by an astonishing 28%. This severe decline directly correlates with the aggressive expansion of the vice president's discretionary spending accounts. We have uncovered heavily inflated expense reports for luxury international travel that yielded absolutely zero client contracts. We have discovered massive corporate funds being illegally diverted to cover private country club memberships, luxury vehicle leases, and exclusive private parties." The room completely erupted into shocked, angry murmurs. The other executives glared furiously at Marcus, realizing that his reckless, selfish behavior was directly threatening their own livelihoods and their hard-earned corporate equity. Victor raised his voice to be heard over the rising anger. Furthermore, the recent commercial real estate acquisition in the downtown district, a deal aggressively championed by Marcus, was executed at 30% above the actual market value. Our internal audit proves that the massive broker commission for that specific deal was secretly funneled directly to a shell company owned by one of Marcus's former college fraternity brothers. The vice president has been systematically bleeding the corporate accounts dry. He has practically bankrupted the employee pension fund. He has put everyone's salary, everyone's retirement, and everyone's college fund savings at severe, immediate risk. The silence that followed the CFO's brutal presentation was heavy, dangerous, and absolutely lethal. The illusion of the golden child was completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. My father sat frozen in his chair, his eyes locked onto Marcus in a state of sheer, absolute horror. The golden son, the man he had constantly praised as a ruthless, successful corporate conqueror, was nothing more than a cheap, incompetent thief who was actively destroying his legacy. "Marcus," my father whispered, his voice cracking with genuine, devastating heartbreak, "tell me this is a lie. Tell me you did not steal from our own employees." Marcus backed away from the table, desperately looking around the room for a single ally, but he found nothing but cold, furious glares. "Dad, it is completely complicated. You have to spend money to make money in this industry. It was just a temporary cash flow strategy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, steepling my fingers together in the exact same dismissive gesture my father had used on me 3 years ago in his study. "There is absolutely nothing complicated about embezzlement, Marcus," I stated firmly. "You are completely finished." My father slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogance was completely gone. The booming, authoritative voice was totally absent. He looked like a very old, very tired, completely broken man. "So," my father said, his voice barely a whisper, "what is your grand plan now, Liam? You have publicly humiliated us. You have exposed everything. I assume you are going to aggressively fire us both right here, in front of the entire board? Have security physically drag us out of the building like common criminals? Is that the brutal revenge you have been planning for 3 years?" The entire boardroom held its collective breath, waiting for the final, bloody execution. They fully expected me to drop the axe. They expected me to be exactly like the men I was currently replacing. I looked at my father for a long time. I felt the heavy, intoxicating pull of absolute vengeance. It would be so incredibly easy to utterly destroy them right now. "No," I said, my voice incredibly soft, but carrying a weight that commanded total absolute silence. "I am absolutely nothing like you, Dad. I do not need to publicly destroy people to feel powerful." I stood up from my chair and buttoned my suit jacket. Effective immediately, Marcus is completely stripped of his title as vice president and his massive executive salary is permanently terminated. Furthermore, you, Richard, are removed from the position of chairman of the board. However, neither of you are being fired today. The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Even Elena looked at me with a slight hint of surprise, though she quickly masked it with a proud smile. "You are both going to remain with Dalton and Ross," I announced clearly, making sure every single person in the room heard the exact terms of their punishment. "You will be retained on extremely strict, heavily monitored 6-month contracts as low-level external consultants. You will have absolutely no executive decision-making power. You will have zero access to corporate funds. You will report directly to me, and you will spend the next 6 months watching me meticulously fix every single catastrophic mistake you made. You are going to sit in a small office and learn exactly how not to destroy a company from the inside out." Marcus looked like he was going to violently explode. "I will absolutely never work as a lowly consultant for you. I will quit right now." "If you quit today, Marcus," Elena smoothly interjected, her voice dripping with lethal legal authority, "we will immediately hand the CFO's detailed internal audit directly over to the federal authorities and file a massive criminal lawsuit for corporate embezzlement. The choice is entirely yours. A small, heavily monitored cubicle or a federal prison cell. Take your pick." Marcus collapsed back into his chair, utterly defeated, the realization of his complete and total trap finally washing over him. My father simply lowered his head into his hands, unable to look anyone in the eye. I turned around and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. "The new executive restructuring plan will be distributed via email by noon. Thank you all for your time. Let us get back to work." As Elena and I walked out of the boardroom, the sound of hesitant, but rapidly growing applause began to fill the room behind us. I had not just won the battle. I had completely redefined the rules of the war. But the desperate remnants of a dying dynasty are always the most dangerous, and I was about to learn that a cornered animal will use absolutely any dirty trick to survive. The illusion of peace lasted for exactly 48 hours. Tuesday had been an incredibly productive day. Elena and I officially moved into the massive, glass-walled executive penthouse office on the top floor of the Dalton and Ross building. We immediately began implementing our comprehensive restructuring strategies, freezing the corrupted expense accounts, and reassuring the terrified employees that their jobs and their retirement funds were finally secure. The corporate atmosphere shifted almost instantly from suffocating fear to a cautious, desperately hopeful optimism. My father and Marcus were completely invisible, hiding in their newly assigned, severely downsized offices on a lower floor, entirely stripped of their power and their prestige. I genuinely thought the heavy lifting was finally over. I thought we had successfully navigated the storm and could finally focus on rebuilding the empire. I was aggressively, dangerously wrong. Wednesday morning started normally. I was sitting at my massive new desk, reviewing a highly lucrative potential real estate development contract, when the heavy glass door to my office suddenly flew open. Anna, my newly appointed executive assistant, burst into the room. Her face was completely pale, and she was practically shaking as she clutched a silver corporate tablet to her chest. "Liam, I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt," Anna stammered, her voice breathless with panic. "But you absolutely need to see this right now. It is currently spreading everywhere." I put down my pen, a cold knot of dread instantly forming in the pit of my stomach. Elena, who had been reviewing legal documents on the comfortable leather sofa across the room, immediately stood up and walked over. Anna placed the tablet onto my desk and hit the play button. It was a highly produced, heavily edited video clip spreading like absolute wildfire across every major social media platform and several sleazy financial gossip blogs. The video featured Marcus, sitting in what looked like a dimly lit, somber living room, looking disheveled and deliberately crying forced, crocodile tears directly into the camera lens. "My name is Marcus, and I am the victim of a massive, highly illegal corporate theft orchestrated by my own deeply troubled younger brother, Liam," Marcus said in the video, his voice trembling with fake, highly rehearsed emotion. "3 years ago, Liam went completely bankrupt due to gross incompetence. My father and I tried to help him, but he became deeply vindictive. Last week, using heavily forged documents, illegal offshore funds, and severe elder abuse tactics against our retiring chairman, Arthur, Liam executed a fraudulent hostile takeover of Dalton and Ross. He is currently attempting to steal the inheritance of our entire family, aggressively firing loyal employees, and draining the corporate accounts to fund his own lavish lifestyle. I am begging the authorities to intervene before he destroys everything my family built." The video then cut to a heavily blurred, anonymous interview with a woman whose voice was aggressively digitally altered. "Liam is a complete monster," the altered voice claimed. "I used to work closely with him. He is a pathological liar who routinely manipulated financial records. He planned this illegal takeover for years just to violently punish his family for cutting him off." The video ended with a massive, bold graphic urging people to share the truth and demanding a federal criminal investigation. I stared at the black screen of the tablet, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the lies temporarily paralyzing my brain. It was a perfectly executed, incredibly dirty public relations smear campaign. Marcus had used his old contacts in the slimy underbelly of the corporate media world to launch a highly coordinated, devastatingly fast attack on my reputation. "The corporate switchboard is absolutely lighting up," Anna said, her voice shaking. "Major investors are calling, demanding immediate explanations. The company stock price has already taken a significant hit in the pre-market trading. Several key clients are threatening to completely pull their massive contracts by the end of the business day." Elena leaned over the desk, her eyes narrowed into dangerous, calculating slits. "Play the audio of the anonymous woman again." "Just the audio." Anna quickly skipped the video back and hit play. We listened to the digitally altered voice closely. Elena suddenly reached out and tapped the pause button. "It is Chloe," Elena said, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. I felt a sharp, painful sting of pure betrayal hit my chest. Chloe had been my very first executive assistant when I initially started my small design firm years ago. I had completely trusted her. But when the firm hit severe financial trouble, I caught her actively stealing from the petty cash fund and quietly selling our proprietary client contact lists to rival agencies. I had fired her quietly, choosing not to press criminal charges simply out of pity. Clearly, Marcus had somehow tracked her down, realized she held a deep grudge, and heavily paid her off to be his star anonymous witness in this fraudulent smear campaign. The door to the office opened again, and Harrison, our brilliant, aggressively sharp senior corporate lawyer, walked into the room. He did not look panicked. He looked like a highly trained predator who had just spotted his prey. I assume you have both seen the absolute garbage fire currently circulating on the internet? Harrison asked, dropping a thick leather briefcase onto the glass table. Marcus has officially crossed the line from corporate incompetence into massive, highly actionable criminal defamation. How bad is the immediate fallout, Harrison? I asked, forcing my voice to remain completely steady. I absolutely refused to let Marcus see me sweat. It is a highly aggressive PR nightmare, Liam, Harrison admitted, opening his briefcase. The media loves a scandalous family drama. They love the narrative of the bitter, bankrupt younger brother stealing the family inheritance and ruining the golden child. We are already preparing a massive, multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit against Marcus and whatever cheap media outlet he used to publish this garbage. But a lawsuit will take months to litigate in the courts. We do not have months. If we do not kill this false narrative right now, the investors will completely panic, the board will force a vote of no confidence, and the company will bleed out by Friday. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the sprawling city. I thought about the 3 agonizing years I spent crawling out of the dark hole of bankruptcy. I thought about the relentless humiliation I suffered at the steakhouse. Marcus was desperately trying to drag me right back into the mud, using the exact same manipulative tactics of public humiliation that my father had taught him. But I was absolutely not playing their game anymore. I was playing my own. We are not going to hide behind a slow legal lawsuit, I said, turning around to face the room. My mind was completely clear, the strategy rapidly forming with lethal precision. We are going to cut the head completely off the snake in broad daylight. Anna, contact the corporate press office immediately. I want an emergency, live-streamed press conference scheduled in the main lobby auditorium for exactly noon today. Invite every single major financial news outlet in the city. Tell them the new CEO of Dalton and Ross is going to address the fraud allegations live. Anna nodded frantically and literally ran out of the office to make the calls. I turned to Harrison. I need the fully verified, unredacted SEC financial transfer documents. I need the forensic accounting reports detailing Marcus's embezzlement. And most importantly, I need the secure USB drive that Arthur gave us during the final signing. Harrison smiled, a sharp, dangerous grin. I have it all right here, ready to be deployed. We are going to legally incinerate him. At exactly 11:55 a.m., I stood behind the heavy curtain of the main lobby auditorium. The large room was completely packed with aggressive reporters, flashing camera bulbs, and eager bloggers looking for blood. The loud, chaotic murmuring of the crowd sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. Elena stood right beside me, holding my hand tightly, her presence a constant, unbreakable anchor. Ready to end this? She whispered. Let's burn it down, I replied. I walked out from behind the curtain and stepped confidently up to the wooden podium. A massive barrage of camera flashes temporarily blinded me, and several aggressive reporters immediately started shouting loud, accusatory questions about elder abuse, stolen inheritance, and corporate fraud. I did not yell over them. I simply stood silently at the podium, projecting absolute, unshakable authority, until the heavy silence in the room forced them to quiet down and listen. False narratives spread incredibly fast when the absolute truth threatens fragile, pathetic egos. I began, my voice amplified by the microphone, echoing powerfully across the massive auditorium. This morning, a highly edited, completely fraudulent video was released by my brother, Marcus, accusing me of illegal corporate theft and elder abuse. I am not here to offer you emotional denials. I am here to offer you absolute, undeniable facts. I pressed a button on the podium remote. The massive digital screen behind me instantly lit up, displaying the heavily redacted, but clearly authentic, Securities and Exchange Commission transfer documents. Document 1, I stated firmly, the fully executed, federally verified transfer of majority shares. Notice the signatures. Notice the absolute lack of coercion. This was a standard premium cash buyout. I pressed the button again. The screen shifted to display the highlighted sections of the internal CFO audit, clearly detailing Marcus's massive, illegal discretionary spending and fraudulent real estate deals. Document 2, I continued, pointing at the damning numbers. The internal financial audit proving that the former vice president, Marcus, was aggressively embezzling millions of dollars in corporate funds to sustain his personal lifestyle, putting the salary and college fund accounts of every single employee in this building at severe risk. That is the exact reason he was entirely stripped of his executive power on Monday morning. His viral video is nothing more than the desperate, pathetic retaliation of a man who got caught stealing. The reporters in the front row were frantically typing on their laptops, the completely shifted narrative taking them by absolute surprise. But I was not finished. I had one final, lethal weapon to deploy. Marcus claims I abused our former chairman, Arthur, and stole the company from him, I said, my voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone. Instead of listening to my defense, I believe you should hear directly from Arthur himself. I pressed the button one final time. The screen went dark for a second, and then a crisp, high-definition video of Chairman Arthur appeared. He was sitting in his comfortable home library, looking completely relaxed and incredibly sharp. The video had been recorded as a strict legal contingency on the exact day we signed the final paperwork. My name is Arthur, former chairman of Dalton and Ross, the older man said clearly in the video, looking directly into the camera lens. I am recording this statement completely voluntarily. I sold my entire majority stake to Liam and Elena because they are brilliant, highly ethical leaders. I desperately needed to sell the company because the previous vice president, Marcus, was aggressively destroying my life's legacy through gross incompetence and massive financial theft. Liam did not steal this company. He rescued it. Any claim to the contrary is an absolute, actionable lie. The entire auditorium erupted into absolute, chaotic pandemonium. Reporters were literally shouting over each other, demanding more details about Marcus's embezzlement. The flashing cameras went into a complete frenzy. I looked out over the chaotic sea of journalists, and my eyes naturally tracked to the very back of the massive room. Standing near the heavy exit doors, wearing dark sunglasses and a trench coat to hide his identity, was Marcus. He had desperately snuck into the press conference, hoping to gleefully watch my public destruction. Instead, he was watching his own absolute, inescapable execution. Even from that massive distance, I could see his jaw trembling violently. He was completely pale, sweating profusely under the harsh auditorium lights. He realized in that exact, crushing moment that the Golden Child narrative was permanently dead. He was not a victim. He was a publicly exposed corporate thief, and there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. I stared directly at him across the massive room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply let the absolute weight of the truth crush him into the floor. Marcus panicked. He turned around, aggressively shoved a reporter out of his way, and bolted out the heavy exit doors, fleeing the building like a terrified, beaten animal. I leaned closer to the microphone, cutting through the shouting crowd. Family can be incredibly complicated, but this corporation is absolutely no longer a dysfunctional family playground. It is a highly ethical, transparent business. The era of corruption is completely over. Thank you. I stepped away from the podium and walked off the stage. The heavy flashbulbs continued to pop like fireworks behind me. The smear campaign was completely dead. The truth was out, and the massive, rotting empire of my father and brother had finally completely collapsed into dust. The immediate aftermath of the explosive press conference was unlike anything the corporate world had ever witnessed. Within mere hours, the entire narrative violently completely flipped. The sleazy financial blogs that had eagerly posted Marcus's fake video were aggressively scrambling to delete the content, desperately issuing public retractions to avoid the massive, multimillion-dollar defamation lawsuit our lawyer, Harrison, had immediately filed on our behalf. The company's stock price, which had dangerously dipped in the early morning trading, violently surged upward as major institutional investors aggressively reacted to the absolute transparency and the ruthless efficiency of the new management team. The toxic, suffocating dark cloud that had hung over Dalton and Ross for years was completely blown away. As I walked through the heavily populated corporate hallways that afternoon, the atmosphere was entirely transformed. Employees who had previously kept their heads down in absolute terror of Marcus's unpredictable temper were now openly smiling. Several people actually stopped me in the corridor to quietly thank me for exposing the embezzlement that had been secretly threatening their hard-earned pension and college fund accounts. For the very first time in my life, I wasn't just existing in the shadow of my family's massive empire. I was the one actively saving it. When the grueling, incredibly long day finally ended, Elena and I returned to our temporary residence in the luxurious corporate penthouse overlooking the sprawling city. The massive adrenaline crash finally hit me, leaving me feeling hollowed out, but incredibly peaceful. I poured 2 glasses of expensive scotch and walked out onto the expansive glass balcony. The cool night air felt incredibly clean. The millions of city lights flickered below us, looking like a vast ocean of glowing stars. Elena walked out onto the balcony and stood quietly beside me. She took the glass of scotch from my hand, but instead of drinking it, she set it down on a small glass table. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small, incredibly elegant velvet box. "I know we have been heavily focused on saving this massive corporation," Elena said softly, the city lights reflecting beautifully in her dark eyes. "But I absolutely did not want you to forget the original dream that brought us together in that cheap coffee shop." She handed me the velvet box. I slowly popped the lid open. It wasn't expensive jewelry. It wasn't a watch. Resting on the dark velvet cushion was a single heavy brass key. "What is this?" I asked, looking up at her in deep confusion. "It is the master key to a completely vacant, fully renovated commercial real estate building in the Arts District." Elena smiled, a genuine, glowing smile. "I quietly purchased the deed 3 weeks ago. It is the new, permanent headquarters for your boutique design firm. The one that carries your name, your vision, and your absolute integrity. You saved Dalton and Ross, Liam. You proved every single person wrong. But you do not have to live in their shadow forever. Let this massive corporate machine run itself. It is finally time for you to build your own legacy." My chest tightened, a massive wave of raw, overwhelming emotion completely flooding my system. It wasn't the arrogant pride of a corporate conqueror. It was the incredibly soft, profound realization that I was finally, truly seen and deeply loved for exactly who I was. I pulled Elena into a tight embrace, burying my face in her shoulder, letting the incredible weight of the past 3 years finally wash away into the night air. Just as we pulled apart, my personal cell phone buzzed loudly on the glass table. I looked at the caller ID. It was a number I had not seen on my screen in a very long time. It was my mother, Beatrice. I hesitated for a long moment, the familiar knot of family anxiety automatically tightening in my stomach. I assumed she was calling to hysterically beg for mercy for Marcus, or to angrily demand that I apologize to my father for completely ruining their public reputation. I almost hit the ignore button, but something deep inside me told me to answer it. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Mom." The line was quiet for several heavy seconds. All I could hear was the faint sound of her unsteady breathing. "Liam," my mother finally said, her voice shaking, but possessing a strange, unfamiliar edge of absolute clarity. "I watched the live broadcast of your press conference this afternoon. I saw the legal documents. I saw what Marcus did to the employee accounts. And I saw exactly how your father reacted when he realized his precious golden boy was a complete fraud. Mom, I did not want it to happen like this in public," I said cautiously. "But they gave me absolutely no choice. Do not apologize to me, Liam. Do not ever apologize for defending yourself against them," she interrupted, her voice gaining sudden, unexpected strength. "I am the one who needs to beg for your absolute forgiveness. I sat silently at that steakhouse dinner. I sat silently when you went completely bankrupt. I traded my courage and my voice for a comfortable life in a massive house, and I allowed my husband to emotionally destroy my youngest son. I have been a profound coward. I leaned against the glass railing, completely stunned by her raw honesty. "Mom, I am leaving him, Liam," she stated firmly, dropping an absolute bombshell that completely shattered my understanding of our family dynamic. "I packed my bags 3 hours ago. I have completely moved out of the estate. I have retained a ruthless, highly aggressive divorce lawyer, and we are heavily auditing his hidden offshore accounts to ensure I get every single penny of my rightful half before he tries to hide the assets. I am filing the official divorce papers first thing tomorrow morning." I was completely speechless. The woman who had been a passive ghost my entire life was finally fighting back. "I am so incredibly proud of the man you have become, Liam," she continued, her voice breaking with genuine, heavy emotion. "You did not just expose their massive corruption. You finally exposed the absolute rot at the center of this family. You gave me the courage to finally escape my own prison. I love you. I will call you when the dust settles." She hung up the phone before I could even formulate a response. I slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly out at the glowing city skyline, the massive, immovable pillars of my childhood, my father's absolute authority, my brother's untouchable golden status, my mother's silent, passive complicity, had all completely collapsed in the span of a few incredibly chaotic days. The empire was burned to the ground, but from the ashes, something entirely new and incredibly healthy was finally beginning to grow. 6 months later, the crisp autumn wind was actively stripping the bright orange leaves from the trees lining the city streets. The strict, 6-month consulting contracts I had aggressively forced upon my father and brother officially expired at 5 p.m. on a Friday. I did not throw a party. I did not go down to their small, heavily monitored office to gloat over their absolute defeat. I simply instructed the corporate security team to quietly escort them out of the building, completely permanently revoking their access badges and demanding the return of their corporate laptops. It was a silent, deeply pathetic end to their massive reign of terror. There was no grand funeral for their corporate careers. They simply faded away into absolute irrelevance. The incredible fallout of their sheer arrogance caught up with them almost immediately. Marcus, completely stripped of his massive executive salary and his totally unearned prestige, was utterly incapable of maintaining his wildly lavish lifestyle. The bank aggressively repossessed his obnoxious white Lamborghini Aventador right out of his luxury apartment parking garage. Without the heavy protection of our father's massive influence, Marcus discovered exactly how the real corporate world treats an exposed embezzler. He was entirely blacklisted from every major financial firm in the city. Last I heard through the corporate grapevine, the former vice president was working a miserable, low-level middle management job at a terrible, failing logistics company, struggling to pay off a massive mountain of legal debt, with absolutely zero hope of a future promotion. He was finally living the exact nightmare of mediocrity he had constantly mocked me for. My father, Richard, faced a significantly quieter, but arguably much more devastating downfall. The highly aggressive divorce proceedings initiated by my mother completely eviscerated his hidden wealth. Her ruthless lawyer legally froze his assets, publicly exposing decades of shady real estate investments and hidden offshore accounts. Stripped of his obedient wife, his golden child's false success, and the absolute power of the Dalton and Ross chairmanship, my father simply completely retreated from society. He sold the massive suburban estate and permanently relocated to a small, isolated cabin near a remote lake upstate. He spends his days completely alone with his massive regrets, finally forced to confront the harsh reality that he had aggressively built his entire life on a foundation of cruelty and manipulation, and it had left him with absolutely nothing. As for me, I am standing on the outdoor rooftop terrace of the beautiful new building Elena purchased for me. The massive sign above the entrance bears the name of my own independent design agency. Business is absolutely booming. Dalton and Ross is thriving under the incredibly capable leadership of Elena and the newly promoted executive board, running with absolute transparency and ethical integrity. I poured myself a simple cup of coffee and leaned against the brick parapet, looking out over the bustling city streets below. I spent so many years consumed by a deep, dark anger. I wanted absolute, violent revenge. I wanted to actively humiliate my family the exact same way they had constantly humiliated me. I wanted to aggressively scream in their faces and completely destroy their lives. But as I stood there in the quiet morning light, I realized that true, profound success doesn't actually come from violently beating your enemies into the ground. It comes from entirely removing their toxic power over your own mind. I didn't destroy my father and brother. Their own sheer, blinding arrogance and massive greed destroyed them. I simply held up a giant, legally binding mirror and forced the entire world to look at their true reflection. The absolute greatest victory I achieved wasn't taking over a massive, multimillion-dollar corporation. The greatest victory was completely breaking the generational curse of toxicity. It was proving to myself that I could hold absolute, ultimate power without ever becoming the cruel, manipulative monster my father desperately wanted me to be. I learned that establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of weakness. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Some incredibly deep wounds never fully heal, but they eventually stop actively bleeding, and they teach you exactly how to live a deeply authentic, honorable life. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to establish incredibly firm boundaries with the very people who were supposed to love you the most? Have you ever walked away from a toxic environment to build your own absolute success? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.